The red emergency lights flashed across Commander Elias Wright's face as two security officers pulled him through the crowded hallway of the Hyperion. His wrists hurt from the tight restraints behind his back. 3 years of service on this ship, and now his own crew looked at him like he was a monster. "Move it, Commander," one guard said, pushing him forward. Crew members pressed against the walls as they passed. Some looked away. Others stared with open fear or anger. These were people Elias had eaten meals with, trained with, even saved during the asteroid field incident last year. "Please, listen to me," Elias said calmly, even as his heart raced. "Someone is setting me up. I didn't sabotage anything." The ship trembled beneath them. Another system failure, the third one this week. Perfect timing to make him look guilty. Around the corner stood Captain Reynolds, her silver hair pulled back tightly, her mouth a thin line of disappointment. Next to her, Security Chief Voss looked smug, as if he'd been waiting for this moment since Elias got promoted ahead of him last year. "The evidence is clear, Commander Wright," Captain Reynolds said as they approached the brig. 3 critical systems damaged in 1 week. Each time, your access codes were used. "Captain, someone stole my codes," Elias insisted. "I was helping Dr. Seto in medical during the first failure." "Check the logs." "We did," Chief Voss said. "You had time to set the programs before reporting to medical." Very clever alibi. The brig door slid open with a cold hiss. Inside was a small cell with just a bed and toilet. For criminals, not for senior officers who had given everything to the space fleet. Captain Reynolds stepped forward, her eyes searching his face. "The most damning evidence, Commander, is what we found on your personal terminal. The transmissions to the Orion Syndicate." Elias felt like the air had been sucked from his lungs. "What transmissions?" "Coded messages," Voss said, holding up a tablet showing text. "Hidden in what appeared to be personal communications, written in your family's dialect. Did you think our code breakers wouldn't catch it?" Now Elias understood. Those were messages to my grandmother on Earth. Cultural phrases, stories from our heritage. They're not codes. "Save it." "Right," Voss snapped. "The patterns match known syndicate communication protocols." "That's impossible," Elias said, trying to stay calm. "Captain, you've known me for 3 years. I've saved this ship twice. Why would I?" "I'm disappointed, Elias," Captain Reynolds cut him off. "I promoted you despite objections. I trusted you." The guards pushed him into the cell. The barrier field hummed to life, sealing him in. "At least check the transmission timing against the system failures," Elias pleaded. "The real saboteur is still out there." Captain Reynolds turned away, but something in her eyes suggested doubt. Before she could respond, the ship-wide alert system blared to life, its harsh tone echoing through the metal corridors. "Unknown vessel approaching," the AI announced. "Distress signal detected." All eyes turned to the small monitor on the brig wall. It showed a vessel drifting in space, its lights flickering weakly. It was an old research ship, the kind that explored the outer systems where regulations were loose and dangers were plenty. "Captain, to the bridge," came the urgent voice of Lieutenant Park over the comms. Captain Reynolds gave Elias one last look. "We'll deal with this when I return. Keep him under maximum security, Chief Voss." As they hurried away, Elias moved to the barrier, watching the monitor. The ship looked abandoned, but something about it seemed off. The way it drifted wasn't natural. And those markings on its hull, he'd seen something like them before, in the historical archives he studied during his free time. "Be careful," he whispered, even though no one could hear him. Something's not right about that ship. Sitting on the hard brig bed, Elias closed his eyes. He needed to think. Someone had framed him perfectly, using his family's cultural communications against him. But why? What was happening on the Hyperion that someone needed him out of the way? The answer, though he didn't know it yet, was drifting closer by the second, disguised as a ship in distress. Elias pressed his forehead against the energy barrier of his cell, straining to see the small monitor on the wall. It showed the boarding party from the Hyperion approaching the mysterious research vessel. Lieutenant Park led the team, her movements cautious as they entered through the ship's damaged airlock. "Check for survivors," Captain Reynolds ordered through the comlink. Her voice sounded tinny through the brig's speakers. Elias watched as the boarding party moved through empty corridors. Their helmet lights cast long shadows in the abandoned ship. No bodies, no signs of a fight, just emptiness. "Captain, you need to pull them out," Elias muttered to himself. Something isn't right. On the screen, Lieutenant Park stopped suddenly. "Captain, we found something. There are markings on the walls." The camera on Park's helmet showed strange symbols etched into the metal walls. Spirals connected to angular lines, forming patterns that seemed to pulse in the light. Elias stepped back from the barrier, his heart beating faster. "I've seen those before," he whispered. When he was studying at the academy, he had become fascinated with a case from 50 years ago. A mining colony had gone silent. When rescue teams arrived, they found similar markings and all colonists dead or missing. The case was classified and buried, but Elias had found references in old historical archives. On screen, Park reached toward a strange object attached to a console. It looked like a pulsing pod, semi-transparent with something moving inside. "Captain, we found some kind of biological sample container. It appears active. Requesting permission to bring it aboard for Dr. Sato to examine." "No," Elias shouted, pounding his fist against the barrier. "Don't bring anything back." But no one could hear him. Captain Reynolds gave permission, and Park carefully detached the pod, placing it in a containment box. "Returning to the Hyperion," Park reported. "No survivors found." The screen went to static briefly. When the image returned, the boarding party was heading back to the airlock, Park clutching the sample container. Something about their movements seemed different, more rigid, mechanical. Elias paced his small cell. He had to warn someone. He pressed the call button for the guard, but no one responded. Through the barrier, he could see the guard station was empty. Hours passed. The lights in the brig dimmed for night cycle. Elias lay on his bed, unable to sleep, his mind racing with everything he knew about those symbols and what they might mean. He jolted awake to flickering lights. He hadn't realized he'd fallen asleep. The power was fluctuating, but not randomly. Elias watched carefully, counting the pattern. 3 long pulses, 4 short, 3 long. The same pattern as the markings on the wall of the research vessel. Elias moved to the small window in his cell door. From there, he could see a portion of the corridor outside the brig. 2 crew members walked past, Ensign Chin from engineering and Officer Rodriguez from navigation. Their movements were stiff, their faces blank. They stopped at a control panel, touching it in sequence. 3 long presses, 4 short, 3 long. They're being controlled, Elias realized with growing horror. Later that night, he heard footsteps approaching. Dr. Sato appeared at his cell, looking like she needed help. Her uniform was torn, and she walked with a limp. "Doctor, what's happening out there?" Elias called. Sato turned toward him, and Elias stepped back instinctively. Her eyes were clouded with something dark and moving beneath the surface. Thin black veins spread across her face like cracks in glass. "Doctor." She stared at him without recognition, then continued past his cell toward the ship's core systems. "Help," Elias shouted, pounding on the barrier. "Security. Anyone. The ship is being taken over." Only silence answered him. Through his small window, he watched as more crew members walked by, all with the same blank expressions, all moving with the same unnatural stiffness. The lights flickered again, then dimmed further. Systems across the ship were being shut down one by one. In the distance, he heard someone scream, then silence. Elias slid down against the wall of his cell. He was trapped while something took over his ship and his crew. And no one knew he had the knowledge that might save them all. The sound of blaster fire jerked Elias from his uneasy sleep. He jumped to his feet as the lights in the brig flickered. Through his cell window, he saw flashes of energy weapons in the corridor. Someone was fighting. Security Chief Voss stumbled into view, firing her blaster behind her. Her uniform was torn, and blood ran down her face from a deep cut above her eye. She lurched toward the brig controls, checking over her shoulder every few steps. "Voss," Elias called out. "What's happening?" She turned at his voice, her expression a mix of fear and determination. Her hand hovered over her blaster for a moment. Then she limped to the control panel. "Right," she gasped, typing in a code. The barrier to his cell disappeared. "Captain's down. Most of command deck too." Elias stepped out cautiously. "The parasites from the research vessel. They're controlling the crew, aren't they?" Voss's eyes widened. "How did you know?" "The power fluctuations match patterns I studied during my specialized training at the academy. And those symbols on the research vessel, they were recorded in an old incident, classified, but I found references in the historical archives." Another blast hit the wall near them. Voss winced and handed Elias her spare blaster. "We can discuss how you accessed classified files later. Right now, we need to move." Elias checked the weapons charge. How many crew members are still themselves? "Not many," Voss admitted, peering around the corner. "Maybe 15, scattered throughout the ship. The infected are hunting us down one by one. We need to find the others and form a plan," Elias said. "The parasites must have a weakness." They moved cautiously through the corridors, avoiding the main passages. Twice they had to hide in maintenance closets as groups of infected crew members walked by, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. "Why didn't you get infected?" Elias asked quietly as they waited for a patrol to pass. Voss touched the cut on her forehead. "I was suspicious when Park's team returned. Something was off about them. I started monitoring their movements and saw them accessing restricted systems. When I confronted Park, she attacked me. I managed to escape." She looked at him with reluctant respect. "I was wrong about you, right? You were set up. One of the infected crew admitted it before they tried to convert me." "Why would they target me specifically?" "Because you were the only one who might recognize what was happening," Voss said. "They found your search history in the archives." They reached a storage bay where several crew members were hiding. Engineer Chen looked up from the makeshift barricade, her face relaxing when she saw Voss. Then her eyes landed on Elias, and she raised her weapon. "It's okay," Voss said quickly. "He's clean, and he knows what we're dealing with." Communications Officer Dias stepped forward. "The commander, but I thought he was the saboteur." "He was framed," Voss said simply. "And right now, he's our best chance." The small group looked at Elias with a mixture of hope and suspicion. Besides Chen and Dias, there were 3 junior officers he recognized from different departments. "The parasites are not invincible," Elias explained, gathering them around. "From what I've studied, they have one major weakness. They can't survive certain sound frequencies, but we need to reach the main engineering console to broadcast it ship-wide." "That's on Deck 4, Chen said. "The infected have the heaviest presence there. They seem to be protecting something. Probably their central node." Elias nodded. "These parasites often establish a hub to coordinate their actions." As he spoke, a warning light flashed overhead, and the ship's AI announced in its calm voice, "Warning. Life support systems compromised in residential sectors, A through D oxygen levels decreasing." "They're trying to smoke us out," Dias whispered, fear in her eyes. "Or weaken anyone hiding." Elias checked his weapon and looked at the faces around him. People who just days ago had believed him a traitor. Now they were his only allies in saving the ship. "We need to move now," he said with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. "I know another way to engineering through the maintenance tunnels." Voss nodded grimly. "Lead the way, Commander." For the first time since his arrest, Elias felt the weight of his rank again. These people were counting on him. He wouldn't let them down. The maintenance tunnel was barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. Elias led the way, his elbows scraping against the metal as he moved forward. Behind him, Voss, Chen, Diaz, and the 3 junior officers followed in a line. "These tunnels run through the entire ship," Elias explained in a hushed voice. "Maintenance crews use them to access systems without disrupting ship operations." "How do you know about these?" Chen whispered, her breath warm on his ankle as she crawled behind him. Elias paused at a junction. Checking a small map he pulled up on his wrist device. "When people look at you with suspicion all the time, you learn to find quiet places. Places where you can just be yourself for a while." The group fell silent, understanding in their eyes. Even Voss looked away, perhaps remembering the times she'd watched Elias with distrust. "Take the left tunnel here," Elias directed. "It will lead us around the main corridor where most of the infected crew would be patrolling." As they crawled further, the air became thinner. The life support systems were failing in more sections of the ship. "We're getting close to engineering," Elias said after 20 minutes of difficult crawling. "Once we're there, Shen can help me access the main systems to generate the frequency." Diaz moved up beside him as they reached a wider section where they could sit up. She touched his shoulder gently. "I'm sorry, Commander," she said, her eyes sincere, "for believing the worst about you, for not speaking up when they arrested you." Before Elias could respond, a loud bang echoed through the tunnel ahead of them. A panel burst open, and 3 infected crew members lunged into the maintenance shaft, their eyes vacant, movements jerky and unnatural. "Back!" Elias shouted, raising his blaster. He fired a stun blast, hitting the first infected crew member. The person, Ensign Torres from security, fell but kept moving, crawling forward with unnatural determination. The group scattered backwards, firing their weapons. In the narrow space, the blasts ricocheted dangerously off the metal walls. "There's another access point 10 meters back," Elias called out as more infected appeared from side tunnels. "Get to engineering. I'll hold them here." "We can't leave you," Voss argued, firing over his shoulder. "The ship needs you more than it needs me," Elias said firmly. "Chen knows enough about the frequency now. Go." He pushed Voss toward the others, then turned back to face the approaching infected crew. They'd moved like broken puppets, their eyes filled with writhing darkness. "Go," he shouted again, firing repeatedly to create a barrier of energy blasts. Voss hesitated, then nodded sharply. "Don't die." "Right. That's an order." "Yes, Chief," Elias said with a grim smile. He watched as they disappeared down the side tunnel, then turned his full attention to the infected. They were coming from both directions now, their numbers growing. Among them, he recognized faces of friends and colleagues, people he'd worked with, laughed with, shared meals with. Now they were empty vessels for the parasites. Elias backed into a corner where 2 tunnels met, giving him the best position to hold them off. His blaster whined as it began to overheat from continuous fire. "Come on then," he muttered, setting it to maximum stun. "Let's see how many of you I can stop." The first wave rushed him all at once. Elias fired until his blaster wouldn't fire anymore, then used it as a club, striking at the reaching hands and distorted faces. He fought with everything he had, but there were too many. A sharp pain pierced his neck. He felt something cold enter his skin, spreading through his veins like ice water. One of the infected had managed to get close enough to jab him with something, a tool modified into a crude injector. Darkness edged his vision as he slumped against the wall. The parasites were entering his system now. He could feel them trying to take hold, to turn him into one of the mindless drones surrounding him. "I'm sorry," he whispered, not knowing if he would wake as himself again. His last conscious thought was of his grandmother on Earth, and how she had always told him to fight when the world turned against him. Then blackness took him, and Elias Wright disappeared into the swarm of infected crew members. Darkness filled Elias's mind, but through it came insistent whispers. The parasite inside him was trying to take control, sending commands to his brain. "Stand up. Join the others. Help us take the ship." But something in Elias fought back. His consciousness, buried deep, refused to surrender completely. "Take control," the parasite commanded inside his head. "No," Elias fought back, gathering his strength. He became aware of his body again, sprawled on the cold floor of the maintenance tunnel. The infected crew had left him, assuming the parasite would take over and he would follow. But minutes passed, and Elias remained himself, though weakened. With tremendous effort, he opened his eyes. His vision was blurry, tinged with darkness at the edges. The parasite squirmed inside him, trying to spread, but something was stopping it from taking full control. My grandmother's blood, Elias realized with sudden clarity. The genetic markers passed down through generations of her family, descendants of maroon communities who had developed natural immunities to tropical parasites centuries ago. He wasn't immune, but he could resist long enough to fight back. Elias forced his body to move, crawling through the maintenance tunnel toward the bridge. Every movement was agony, every inch a battle against the creature trying to claim him. "The others will reach engineering," he thought, dragging himself forward. "But they'll need the command codes only senior officers have." Somewhere on the ship, Voss and the others would be trying to generate the frequency to disrupt the parasites. But without the captain's authorization codes, they couldn't broadcast it shipwide. Elias knew he had to reach the bridge. Captain Reynolds would be there, infected or dead, and her command console would give him access to the codes. The journey through the tunnel seemed endless. Twice he had to hide from patrols of infected crew. The parasite inside him grew weaker as his unusual blood chemistry slowly poisoned it, but the battle drained his strength too. Finally, he reached the access panel behind the bridge. Pressing his ear to it, he heard movement inside. The shuffling of feet, the low murmur of voices that didn't sound quite human. Elias checked his wrist device. Nearly 2 hours had passed since he'd separated from the others. They would be in position by now, waiting for the command codes to activate the ship-wide broadcast system. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the panel and tumbled onto the bridge. 5 infected crew members turned toward him, including Captain Reynolds. Her once sharp eyes were now clouded with the same darkness he'd seen in the others. "He resists," the captain said, but her voice was flat, emotionless. "Take him." Elias pushed himself up, staggering toward the captain's chair. The infected crew moved to intercept him, their movements jerky but purposeful. "Captain," Elias gasped, appealing to whatever might remain of Reynolds inside. "It's Commander Wright. Remember me." No recognition showed in her eyes. Elias ducked under the grab of one infected officer and lunged for the command console. His hand slammed down on the authentication panel. "Commander Elias Wright," he shouted. "Emergency protocol, Omega-9." The computer recognized his voice and palm print. The console lit up with emergency options. Infected crew grabbed at him, pulling him away, but he'd already gotten access. With the last of his strength, Elias input the frequency it would disrupt the parasite's control. His fingers flew across the panel, programming the broadcast to cover every section of the ship. "Authorization code. Reynolds Alpha 79, he gasped, using the captain's emergency override that all senior officers memorized during crisis training. An infected crew member wrapped hands around his throat, cutting off his air. Spots danced in his vision as he hit the final command to activate the ship-wide broadcast. A high-pitched tone filled the bridge. The sound wasn't just audible. It resonated through the metal of the ship itself, amplified by the structure. The hands around his throat loosened. All around him, the infected crew collapsed to their knees, clutching their heads. Dark shapes began to emerge from their eyes, noses and mouths, the parasites forced out by the frequency, withering as they were exposed to it. Elias felt the creature inside him struggle, then dissolve. Pain lanced through his body as the parasite died, but sweet relief followed. He crawled to the captain, who lay unconscious but breathing on the floor. Across the ship, he knew the same scene would be playing out. The parasites dying, the crew members freed. "We did it," he whispered, before darkness claimed him again. But this time, it was just exhaustion, not invasion. 2 weeks later, the Hyperion docked at Starbase 12. The crew had recovered, though many still had nightmares about their time under the parasite's control. In the main hall of the ship, the entire crew gathered for a special ceremony. Captain Reynolds, still weak but standing tall, pinned a medal to Elias's uniform. "Commander Wright saved this ship and everyone aboard," she announced, her voice strong despite her ordeal. His unique knowledge, perspective, and incredible resistance made him see what the rest of us couldn't. We all owe him our lives and our apologies. Elias looked out at the faces now filled with respect rather than suspicion. Chief Voss nodded to him, a new understanding between them. Chen and Diaz smiled widely, their earlier doubts completely erased. "We're stronger together," Elias said simply. "All of us, with our differences. That's what makes humanity worth saving." As the crew applauded, Elias thought of his grandmother and her stories of resistance and resilience. She had prepared him for this moment without ever knowing it. To stand tall in the face of prejudice and save those who had judged him. The Hyperion would continue its mission, but something fundamental had changed. And as Elias took his place on the bridge again, he knew that change was for the better.